Hey y'all, this is Max again. It's good to be with you this week. One thing that I really love that we do with Men's Bible Study is we have a rotating team of teachers, and so today you're actually going to hear from one of our deacons at Mosaic, Nick Hayden. I trust that you'll be blessed from the time, and we're praying for you in the midst of it. We'll catch you next week.
Guys, hi, this is Nick Hayden, deacon at Mosaic Church. It's my absolute pleasure and a great blessing to be able to bring to you our text tonight, Ruth chapter 1, verse 6 through verse 22. Give me a little bit of grace, never taught into a camera before, so feels a little odd. I'm used to having an audience that reacts to things and to feed off of, and right now I'm in an empty room with the doors shut and Max is on the outside watching or on his phone or doing whatever he's doing. So, but again, thrilled to be with you guys and excited about the text. So we're going to jump right in. I'm not going to read the text. You should have already done that in your small group, and that'll save us a little bit of time as well. I want to start with a confession, and that confession is when I first heard that we were going to be going over Ruth, I didn't really know what to think. I kind of thought that was a book for frankly, women, for our wives, that we were going to be teaching on some stuff, and it was going to kind of encourage you guys to go back to maybe your wives or friends that were girls and encourage them in some way. And man, I was really convicted by the Spirit as I dove into this text with what I got out of it. And I was reminded that God's word is living and breathing, and that it never comes back empty. That's Hebrews 4:12 and Isaiah 55:11. And so it was really an encouragement not to think that I'm going to read God's word and not get something out of it for myself. And so that's a reminder for other books of the Bible besides Ruth as well. The second thing that was really cool about Ruth was we found out we were teaching about Ruth this year, and this has obviously been a crazy year with COVID-19. And Ruth was really impactful for me in processing COVID, and specifically something we'll dive into in this section, a lament. And whether COVID-19 has been super easy for you and just a little disrupting of your life, or whether it's been super impactful in a negative way and that you've lost a job or maybe a loved one, it's been a crazy time for all of us, and something that we, if you haven't done, you should bring before the Lord. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but Ruth really encouraged me to bring my thoughts and processing before God as far as this pandemic is concerned. Our thesis for tonight is pretty simple. I'm gonna say it twice in different ways. So God's providential care happens in the ordinary, and He is intimately involved with us. So again, let me say our thesis for tonight. God's providential care happens in the ordinary, and He is intimately involved with us. Another way we might say that is God's purposes are good, and He is all-powerful. He cares for us intimately in everyday life. So again, I want you to be able to draw this thesis in some way yourself as you read the text. So I'm stating it in two different ways. I'll say that second part again. God's purposes are good, and He is all-powerful. He cares for us intimately in everyday life. So as we go through verses 6 through 12, chapter 1, we're really going to break it up into kind of two sections. We're first going to talk about the characters. So generally we'll talk about Naomi in each verse. Ruth will come up later on in the section, and then we'll jump to what does this verse say about God. And so we'll try and walk through verse by verse. So we enter the story right now, and it's a pretty sad scene. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah are all widows. They have no children. Specifically, they have no sons. And they are basically alone with each other. In this culture today, there would not have been much value put on these women. And so really all they had was each other and, of course, God. But they didn't have very much hope that any of their their circumstances were going to improve. So it's a pretty desperate time and a sad time. We don't know exactly when each of their spouses died, but obviously death, and especially death of a spouse, takes a long time to get over and to mourn. And so regardless at what point in those 10 years these deaths happened, they're probably still feeling those wounds and that sadness. So setting the scene, it's just a dark, sad time. So we'll jump into verse 6. Verse 6 says, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, she being Naomi, to return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So what does it say about Naomi? One, she's hearing this message in the fields of Moab. So we know that she is hard at work. She's in the field. She is picking grain or wheat or some other type of food so that she can provide for herself and for her daughters-in-law. We don't know if her daughter-in-laws are in the field with her or not, but we just know that Naomi is hard at work. And while it seems that Naomi isn't starving, they are like we mentioned at the beginning, they're in a sad, desperate situation. So they do have food, because otherwise she wouldn't be in the field gathering food. We see Naomi's faithfulness to God, and that when she hears the message that God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has returned to her people, she leaves a sure thing in the fact that she has food to return to her God. So there's a faithfulness there that is to be admired and imitated. And then I know I've had this thought that at times, and we'll cover this in several different sections as we go through the text, but at times it seems like Naomi is really just bitter, almost like she's shaking her fist at God. I have thought that in reading Ruth multiple times. I'm not sure if you guys have had that same thought. But we can see throughout the text, and especially in these upcoming verses, that she does respond to God's call. She is returning to God. She moves towards God. And so while her words at times are very sad, frustrated, filled with bitterness, her actions show that she still trusts that God is sovereign, in control over all things, and she moves towards him. And that's something that we should also imitate in Naomi, is that, yes, we can communicate to God how we're feeling, what's going on in our life, but we also need to move towards God, because he is good and he takes care of us every day. So what does this verse say about God? A small but obvious point is that God is providing for Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, and that they have food, that there is food in Moab, and they are able to survive. And that seems really small, but I think oftentimes about how when my family sits down for dinner, we pray and we thank God for our meal. Or and when Jesus teaches us to pray, he says, thanking God for our daily bread. This is a small act of God's control and provision in an ordinary thing that we do every day and that we often take for granted. And so it's good to be reminded to thank God for his provision. The other thing that's pretty amazing is that God gives Naomi this message in the field, really the message at all. And we don't really know how the message is communicated to her. We just know that she receives it. And this is in a time and a day and age where there wasn't texting, there wasn't emails, there wasn't even postal service. So however far, the distance between Israel and Moab, the fact that Naomi finds this out, that in and of itself is a provision of God so that she has the opportunity to return and respond. So verse 7, it continues. This is really just the beginning of the journey. It says, so she set out from the place where she was with her daughter-in-laws, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So just a continuation of this journey. Verse 8, but Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house, and may the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. So here we just see with Naomi that she loves her daughter-in-law. She wants to release them from any type of cultural obligation. She wants them to return to their family so that they might have an opportunity to marry and have heirs of their own. God doesn't leave Naomi alone. What does this verse say about God? Is that he has given Naomi daughter-in-laws who care for her. And we see that in that Naomi desires for God to deal kindly with her daughter-in-laws just as they have dealt kindly with her. And so having kind people around you, of course, is always, friendships, things like that, is always a provision of God that at times we can take for granted. So verse 9, continuing, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And so again, this is just this parting. And so Naomi is just trying to encourage her daughter-in-laws to find rest and peace, that Naomi doesn't believe that she, in and of herself, can provide that, and she desires for them to go to a more sure thing, returning back to their people, returning back to their mother's house, to their father's house, so that they can be married and find rest and peace, because marriage for a woman and obviously an heir were things that provided peace and rest because there was provision there. So verse 10, and they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." So again, mainly this says about Orpah and Ruth that they love Naomi and that they're determined to stay by her side. And what it says about God's provision for Naomi is that she has two daughter-in-laws who care deeply for her. And so that can't be overstated enough that the people that are around us and the people that are around Naomi and Ruth and Orpah, that is a kindness of God that he has provided for, that she is not alone. Both Ruth and Orpah are pretty adamant, but what's missing here is that they're adamant about staying with Naomi and returning to her people. There isn't a mention of returning or staying with God, with Yahweh, which is what Naomi is returning back to. So that part is missing. As we move on to verse 11, it says, "But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands?'" We're going to keep going for 12 and 13. "Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." So really 11, 12, and then 13a, it really shows Naomi's kind of bitterness. It shows her current present situation, and it's also this kind of sarcastic retort that, hey, even if you stay with me, how can I provide anything to you? And so it's Naomi kind of speaking her predicament. And it also gives us a good backdrop for the redemption that's going to come later on, is that the situation really does not seem to have any hope, and yet as we find out with Ruth and Boaz down the line, there is hope and redemption for Naomi, and God is the one who provides that in a way that is miraculous. And so we need to cling to that God is always has a plan that is working, and that we need to trust him. And so this again, like I said, 11, 12, and 13a provides a backdrop for what's going to come later on in the story. 13b, where it says, "No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." This is Naomi turning from speaking to her daughter-in-laws to really speaking to God. She really is communicating her situation, being exceedingly bitter, and that the hand of the Lord has gone against her to the Lord. And this is important because, kind of taking a sidestep, it's a lament. Even though her actions are communicating, as she hears the message, she rises, she's returning to God, to Yahweh, to Israel. Her actions show that she's returning to God. That doesn't mean that her situation is any less sad, frustrating, or bitter. And hopefully what you'll see in the communication that she does with the Lord and with her actions is more of a psalm, in the sense that she is communicating the desperateness of her situation, but also understanding that God is in control, and ultimately that she trusts his plan by returning to him. And even this language that the Lord's hand is against her is her communicating that she almost views that God views her as an enemy, which we know isn't true, but it just shows that she really feels like her situation, there is no hope whatsoever. Yeah, so let's keep going into verse 14, and it says, "Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." So this is Orpah's departure. It's the last time that we'll hear her name. And clearly the text does not say that Orpah has done anything wrong. Orpah tried hard to stay with Ruth, with Naomi, and she was persistent. But we do know that Ruth is continually talked about, obviously, in Scripture, and that Ruth ends up being in the genealogy of Jesus, versus Orpah is never mentioned again. So that is something to note. And we can compare this, that Ruth's obedience and the blessing that she has to Orpah, to the fact that Orpah isn't left. It isn't mentioned again. Attention that we can sit on is the call of the believer to go above and beyond. So one of the things that I see in this section is a similar analogy to when Jesus calls the believer to go, "You have heard it is said, but I tell you." somewhat similar to, Jesus would say, you have heard it is said not to murder, but I tell you, even if you have hate in your heart, you're guilty, essentially, right? Or you've heard it said not to commit adultery, but even when you lust after a woman, that's like committing adultery. So this call of a believer to go above and beyond, and Ruth is walking obediently in that, and that she stays with Naomi. The other thing that shows us about Ruth is we see that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And so here we get to see the beginnings of this this covenantal language. This clung or clings to kind of mirrors the language of marriage. Not to say that at all that Ruth is making a covenantal marriage with Naomi, but Ruth does in the next couple of verses make a covenant with Naomi and to God that she is not going to leave her side. And so in verse 15 is the only hint we really get that Orpah may have done something wrong, and that she said, you see that your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods return after your sister-in-law. This is Naomi telling Ruth, hey, Orpah's gone, even though she doesn't mention Orpah's name. Orpah has gone, you should follow her. And it says to her gods. Well, the Israelites never acknowledged any other gods except for their God. And so here and there is only one God. So we see that obviously Orpah should have stayed and returned to the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, rather than returning to their false gods in Moab. Verse 16, but Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. So this is that covenantal language that Ruth makes to God, but also to Naomi. And it really speaks to Naomi's character and to Ruth's character that this happens, because in order to learn this kind of covenantal language, Ruth would have had to pick it up from someone, and I think that we can look at the text and the 10 years that they spent together and assume that Naomi was teaching her daughter-in-laws about Yahweh, about God, about the covenant that he made with the people of Israel. And Ruth here mirrors that language and that covenant and her pledge to continue to follow Naomi and to make God, the God of Naomi, her God as well. The language, something that we can say besides covenant, is also this idea of hesed, which is just this steadfast love. It's a love that basically means that Ruth is going to love Naomi no matter what Naomi does, that Ruth is going to love Naomi no matter how Ruth feels, that she's going to love Naomi. And this is the love that God has for us, and that's why it's a covenant. It's a covenant of, I'm going to do something regardless of what you are going to do. So verse 18, and when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So this is just kind of the acceptance. Naomi and Ruth are now both moving on towards Bethlehem. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem, and when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? So they persisted in their journey. Naomi and Ruth arrive into the town, and this isn't really the main characters of the story, but when the women say, is this Naomi? When I first read Ruth and when I first read this verse, I kept reading it over and over again thinking, man, it almost sounds like they're gossiping, but really this is more miraculous. For this time period, the traveling back and forth was extremely dangerous, and so for someone to leave for 10 years, much less a woman to leave for 10 years and then to come back alone, was a literal miracle. They are shocked that she is able to make it back. So that really points to God's care in two ways. One, the miracle that she is even returning to Yahweh and to the promised land, but two, also that they made this journey safely. But then two, that all of this has come together as it is. God has provided a way for her to return, which is, very mirrored like imagery to Christ. God has provided a way for us to return to him. And so that is his care for us. Verse 20, she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. So we can take this in a couple of different ways. But the main thing to see in it is that, in our culture today, these public professions of our emotions is kind of looked down upon, and we're supposed to kind of hide our emotions. But in this culture, it was common, a common practice to speak out loud and to make kind of public pronouncements of where you're at. And so Naomi is just continuing to be very real. She has been obedient to God, and that she returned, that she heard his message of his provision for the people of Israel, and that she was obedient to follow that call, even though she had something for sure there. But that doesn't mean that she's not saddened by the losses that she's had. So her actions show that she still trusts and views God as the sovereign, as the all-powerful with good purposes, and her words communicate that she's in a place that is sad. Verse 21, she continues, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So again, she's just continuing this lament, and then even though that she, through her language throughout 6 through 22, has shown that she believes that God is in control and that blessings come from his hand, she also is communicating that her plight is heavy upon her, and that plight has come from God. And so even though that it's sad and it feels like she's not happy in her circumstances, the positive view of God in this is that she does view God as all-powerful, which is an important viewpoint. Verse 22, which is our last verse, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So even though we have this section, which as we open was a sad scene and really is continued, the journey takes a better turn at this point. They've arrived at their destination safely, as provided by God. It says Naomi has returned and Ruth the Moabite has come. So it's clear that Ruth is a foreigner that Naomi has brought with her. And they've come from a foreign country back to the promised land. So it's kind of a summary of the whole section so far. And then kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, is that it's at the beginning of barley harvest. And so in the Old Testament, oftentimes a change for the good was connected with the harvest. And we get to see how Naomi's fortunes turn as the story continues. So what I just want to leave you guys with is, even though, again, I don't know if anybody else felt this, but I certainly felt at the beginning that Naomi seemed to be shaking, kind of Job-like, shaking her fist at God. We get to see through her actions that she returns to God. And so she communicates to God the depth of her sorrow and her plight, but her actions also move her towards God, and some of her words show how she views God as all-powerful and in control. And we get to see Ruth with the covenant and hesed love that she has for Naomi and for God, for Yahweh, and that Ruth commits to not leave Naomi's side. That she, regardless of what Naomi does and regardless of how Ruth feels, Ruth is going to stay by her side, and Yahweh will be her God. So we get to see how their character shines forth. And in all the little things and in the success of their journey back, the deliverance of the message, the provision of food, the provision of company, we get to see how God, who is all-powerful and in control and has good purposes, works those purposes in the everyday life and the travel to provide for Naomi and Ruth to get them back to here. So God has a plan, and his plan is good, and it's happening every day. And so those are things that this section has really taught us, and that I hope you've gotten to see. Now you're going to go back to your small groups and take about 2 minutes to reflect on the text and to reflect on how you see, I hope you reflect on how you see God's care in your life in the ordinary, and how he loves you. Thanks, guys.